Welcome, everyone. My name is Julie Mulvihill, and I'm the Executive Director of Humanities Kansas. And we are just so excited that you are here for The Big Idea. This is a monthly online program to highlight and inspire fresh thinking and scholarship in the humanities. And you are in for a real treat today. And we are so excited that we had more than 100 people register today to be part of Donna Rae's presentation as we recognize the 70th anniversary of the landmark 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. And we're going to find out more about that and what I might have said incorrectly just now. So 2024 is obviously a really important year for both our state and our nation, and we're just taking these spring monthly big idea sessions to explore a little bit of the legacy and the impact of this decision. Now, if you're new here, I want to first of all give a shout out to our watch parties happening at the Topeka Shawnee County Public Library, as well as the Wichita Advanced Learning Library. So welcome to the groups that are gathered there. Each big idea begins with a short essay that's written by our featured speaker that includes additional resources like films or podcasts, books, articles, those sorts of things. And these are all meant to spark a conversation so that you can go home, have dinner with friends, go out for a walk, and have these conversations with one another about what's the big idea? What's the big idea about Brown v. Board today? And so we're hopeful that you can gather around and do that with us as well. We'll put a link to our guest's essay in the chat box for you to review if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet. And the big idea presentation today kind of builds off of that essay that's been written and submitted and gives us the opportunity to ask questions and engage with our speaker in that way. So we welcome you to put your questions and comments in the chat box or in the Q&A, whichever you're more familiar with. And I think it's time for us to get started. So let me introduce our host, Dr. Valerie Mendoza. She's been hosting our big idea now for a few years. We were visiting about that a little bit earlier. Valerie is a Topeka native and received her PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley, and she works in the public humanities. You'll see her involved with Humanities Kansas, as well as the Kansas Historical Society, the Kansas Creative Arts Industries Commission. She is teaching at Kansas City, Kansas Community College, and our state is better for her involvement in the humanities sector. So Dr. Mendoza, take it away.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much. And I am here to introduce our special guest today, Donna Rae Pearson. Donna Rae holds a master's degree in history from Wichita State University and specializes in public history. She's a museum specialist at the Kansas Historical Society. And prior to working there, she was a local history librarian at the Topeka Shawnee County Public Library, where she taught people how to conduct research and work to preserve stories of the Topeka community. She's also a commissioner on the City of Topeka's Local Landmarks Commission and is a board member of Arts Connect in Topeka. And today we are talking about her big idea, rectifying et al. History, the Women of Brown project. So welcome, Donna Rae.
Thank you, Valerie.
And I'm super excited about this project as well and about our conversation today. And I think, people in the audience are going to learn a whole lot of new stuff. So briefly recap for me, kind of the standard narrative of the Brown case, what people normally think of when they hear about it.
I think when people think about the Brown case initially, they first think of Oliver Brown. And then we also talk about the lawyers that were involved, Thurgood Marshall, that it was a Supreme Court case, and that basically it just revolved around one little girl, and her name was Linda Brown, and her inability to go to school in a thoughtful way. So I think that's the first thing that flashes when you think about Brown versus Board of Education.
Okay. And then what do you mean by et al. History?
Yeah, right. It's like, where does that come from? How did I come up with that one? Well, one day I was actually reading when you read about the case, it tends to be shortened to Brown versus Board. And I am even guilty of doing that. I'll say Brown v. or Brown Board, or I'll just say the case. But one day I was reading the actual legal definition, legal title of the case, and it said et al. And I was like, well, what does et al mean? And et al really means and others. So unfortunately, many times in history, and especially when it comes to women's history or African American history, we are not the center of the conversation, even though it was an activity that revolved around us. So, and others means that the women who we haven't talked about yet, there were actually 13 plaintiffs in the case, which most people look at me when I say that. It's like, yeah, there were in others, and those in others were 12 African American women from Topeka, Kansas, that also signed their name on the case as much as Oliver Brown did. So that's what et al is. It's in other history, and how do we open up ourselves to understand all of that history that's involved in the case, not just in this way, but also when it comes to Black history or women's history.
Cool. So let's get into that a little bit. And so provide some context for us about Topeka in the mid 20th century, so we can kind of know how this all came about.
Okay, so I have a really hard time just starting in 1951, but I'll try to consolidate this conversation. In 1951, Topeka was about 10% African American. So we're really not talking about a lot. The community itself was about 8,000. The thing that people don't realize, even though this is, the state of Kansas where we proclaim that everyone came here for freedom, it was not. It was, I call it Northern unfreedom. It's like there were things that you could do and you couldn't do. And so in some ways, legally, there are very few restrictions, but we were still a Jim Crow town, meaning that you weren't necessarily, if you're African American, you were probably going to be sitting in the Jim Crow section of the theater. There were stores that you were not allowed to shop in. There were grocery stores. And as a result, what happens not only in northern states, but also in southerns, they create communities of their own. So within the Black area, there was in the one that comes to mind in particular that people might be able to relate to is called 4th Street. So 4th Street was downtown, was a Black business district, but it was also a residential neighborhood. So, and these weren't the only, 4th Street wasn't the only place like this. There was also Tennessee Town that was an enclave of predominantly African Americans. On the northern side of the river, there was another enclave around McKinley School. There was one around Monroe School. So actually, when you identify the Black schools, the 4 Black schools, that's where you will find concentrations of African Americans.
And was this the first segregation case to be brought up by African Americans in Topeka?
Oh, no. That's one of the that's one of those schizophrenia moments about Kansas. In general, in 1874, we were like one of the first states to actually have a civil rights bill. And we also were one of the first states to pass the 14th Amendment. So you would think we would all be, everyone was moving in the same direction and integration was the norm as opposed to the exception. But in 1879, the Exoduster movement happened. And when that happened, we got a flood, not a flood, that sounds, we got a lot of people migrating to Kansas, and our African American population tripled, I believe. And at that point, the state of Kansas was like, well, we can't do this. So they put into place a permissive school laws that said that if cities of a certain size could segregate. And almost immediately after that, there was the first case that was against the school boards. There were a total of 11 of them across the state. The first one in Topeka was McReynolds, and he was fighting for his son Raul to go to Loman Hill School.
Okay. And so going back to this notion of et al., what many people don't know about the Brown case in particular was that those et al. Women or et al. People were all women, right?
Right.
So can you name them for us? Who are these et al. People?
Well, so I have to cheat.
Obviously.
Yes, I can, but I can name them for you. Darlene Brown, Lena M. Kerper, Sadie Emanuel, Marguerite Emerson, Sherla Fleming, Zelma Henderson, Shirley Hodison, Maud Lawton, Alma Lewis, Iona Richardson, Vivian Scales, and Lucinda Todd. So these 12 women were recruited to sign their names on the line, along with Oliver Brown, protesting the treatment that their children were receiving in school.
Yeah, and something about, as we talked about, that standard narrative, right? And these, even back in the day, these women weren't acknowledged really as plaintiffs. So your project is to rectify that. And tell me some of the things you've learned about these women.
Oh, well, okay. So the structure of the project is, oh, that's lovely. The structure of the project is that we have 3 researchers, and we divided up the women's names and have each kind of dug in different ways. One of the things that initially shocked me, which I didn't realize, was that they were related to one another. I believe it is Vivian Scales and Iona Richardson were actually sisters. There was one of them who was related to the lawyer, one of the Scott lawyers. One of the things that also kind of proves interesting is the fact that I believe out of the 12, 11 of them were not from Topeka. They were not born and raised in Topeka. So bringing that outside influence, and why that's important, some of them were from out of state, but the ones that were here from who were born in Kansas, that means they actually went to schools in rural areas, which you see the difference between a first-class city versus rural segregation. In smaller towns, everyone went to school together. There was no segregation. That doesn't mean they still had equal treatment, don't get me wrong, but they were actually all going to school together versus here in Topeka. So I think they brought that concept, that thought with them when they came here, and they could not quite understand why the children were segregated when they themselves all went to school in integrated areas.
That's really interesting. So how are these women active in their communities? Because I'm going to assume that, 2 things. One, being a plaintiff in a lawsuit is a big deal, especially as this time and as a woman. And 2, this wasn't their first act of a community work.
Yeah, well, African American women have a long tradition of organizing and getting things done. So So when you kind of look at where that comes from, I mean, they're active in their churches, they're active in different social organizations. There's a couple of them that were in sororities and attended school. But I think a lot of that training ground, that fertile work happened in the church setting. Meaning, when pastor has an anniversary coming up, it's not about who's going to do what. It's like everything gets done. And so this is part of the networks that they were probably tapping into in order to find people to participate in the case. They went to their social networks and said, hey, who's going to help out with this and who's going to do this. And that's how I feel like, from what I can tell, they decided to get involved.
And what are some surprising things that you learned about them in your research? Anything that really stood out to you?
I was surprised that there were two of them were pretty young, barely in their mid-20s, which I don't know why I don't think young people can be activists. Maybe now that I'm an old person, it's like, oh, you need time and energy. But the fact that they were willing to, again, step up and get involved in a community conversation that way makes me think we should probably make sure we leave seats at the table for people who are younger than us to make sure they are actively involved in community as well.
Yeah. And so one of the questions we've had here in the chat is, do we know how and why they joined the case on behalf of their children? Why is it Oliver Brown and, 12 women?
Do we know why they actively? Through some oral histories and some interviews, most of the ones that we have been able to find who have answered that question, it really was about the equity, the justice of it all. Meaning, Lucinda Todd, for instance, Lucinda, okay. If I can have favorites, Lucinda is my favorite. So, but the one thing that Lucinda did was she is credited to being one of the first people to write that letter to the national organization. And the interesting thing is she said it wasn't about that she necessarily wanted her child to go to school with another white child. It was the fact that she wanted her daughter to have equal access to different educational opportunities. And I think that is part of what the 1951 case, the local case, was built upon, making sure that the children had equal access to educational opportunities. Also, there was a lot of discussion about transportation to school. These children are being bused across town to go to a school when there is a school literally right up the street or right across the corner from them. So, and you're thinking about Kansas winters. I'm sure they were bad then. I'm sure. Kansas winters are just as bad. Who wants to have your child standing outside on a corner waiting for either the city bus to come or the school bus to come? There was no hot lunches. So most of them, again, were interested in making sure there was equal access to the things that were available to the white students. And you have to understand, these people were paying taxes just as much as the white people were paying. So why weren't they getting the same services? I think is part of the reason why this case launched.
And I think you bring up a really good point in reminding us that it started in 1951, right? Because when we think of it, we think 1954, which we're celebrating, that was when the Supreme Court decision was handed down. But even that decision, that was delayed like a year. They waited an entire year before they rendered it. And I think the other thing that, you and I were talking about before is that this was not a jury trial. You want to speak a little about that?
No, this was not a jury trial. And I'm learning so much about the law. I think I should have been a lawyer. I'm pretty sure I should have been a lawyer. But from what I understand, because this was a case that actually was challenging the 14th Amendment, even at the local level. It wasn't a jury trial. They had to go against 3 justices. So the arguments were done a little bit differently than if it had been in a jury trial. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but go ahead.
No, no, I think that does it. And then I just want to go back to Lucinda Todd for a minute because you mentioned that she wrote a letter and she was actually a member of the local chapter, Topeka chapter of the NAACP, and she wrote a letter to the national, if I'm not mistaken, asking them to take on the case. Is that correct?
Yes, and that's the part I forgot to answer your question. No, I mean, we think of these events as if one day someone woke up and it's like, oh, I'm going to do something different. In 1954, well, that was the culminating moment. But you have to understand there was a lot of back work behind the scenes. Again, this was not the first case. Just a few years earlier in the 1940s, there was another case at the middle school level that that integrated the middle schools in Topeka. So this was a strategic plan at the local level, and I don't think in other cities, of course, they have their story, but in Topeka, we have this very unique story about segregation in Kansas. And again, in the state where everybody supposedly is free and interacts together, which wasn't really quite true.
Do you think, this is a question I think everybody, now that we know that it was Oliver Brown and these 12 women, was that a conscious decision to recruit women to avoid backlash against, male heads of households, or why do you think it was mostly women that served as plaintiffs on behalf of their children?
I think that the women were the ones who were involved in their everyday lives. Whenever someone kind of asks me that, I think of the saying, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, which is very cliche, don't get me wrong, but it's very true in this regard that I believe that the women had the most, and I think one of our researchers, Rome, also highly believes this. It's that the women who knew the details and understood what their children were going through on a daily basis just to get to school. And that's the reason why they are the ones that sign up for the case. And again, like, if you want a job done, ask a Black woman. So.
Right. And Todd herself was a former teacher, right? Lucinda Todd. And I know that at least one of the other women was president of the PTA chapter at, the school her children went to. So, and they were probably the ones who took their kids to school in the morning as well.
Yeah, I think they were the ones that were most involved, and those are the ones who could answer the questions. They're the ones that could answer the question on the daily lives of their children.
So we have a question in the chat. Did the Topeka Black community support this court challenge?
I think there are 2 sides to that conversation, as there is to most conversations. I think there was a certain level of fear about this case. Again, Topeka had a very strong backbone Black community. And so it appears that when these women decided to challenge the system, that they were directly challenging the effectiveness of the teachers, of the school system, and they were not. again, I say that they were trying to make sure they were getting equal access to all the other educational opportunities. So there were people who were resistant and did not like this case being brought forth. And there was a smaller contingent that was very supportive of the case and making sure that it happened. And I think this is something that gets lost in the overall big conversation. Again, we just kind of zoom straight to 1954, not realizing everything that had to go into making sure that this case happened. And it didn't happen in isolation, that there were people who were impacted by this decision one way or the other.
Mhm. Yeah, because in talking to students of that era, we hear a lot about how supportive their teachers were, what an excellent education that they had. So clearly that was not the issue.
Right. I mean, it's kind of like what are we trading for? And sometimes you just don't know the answer to that until later on. But what did we gain and what did we lose by pursuing this case? I think it's a still unanswered question.
Do you want to speak any to the trial itself? Did these women also testify? I know you've read the transcripts.
I know. Again, I should be a lawyer, right? I have read the transcripts, and they were interesting. They did detail basically their getting their kids to school and their interactions. What was interesting that I'm not sure people realize, well, I find it interesting, is that there were actually men who the fathers testified at the trial. Not all of the women plaintiffs testified. And I think that's understanding the difference between a witness list versus a plaintiff's list. So the witness list actually went to support the case that they were bringing against the state, which means that the men were probably, this is 1950s, they were paying taxes versus the women paying taxes. So they needed to speak about that and their impact to their children. And then there were actually other women outside of the plaintiff's list who also testified the impact on their children. So again, there were people who were supportive of the case, but just might not have been heard from as much. And I think that's really something we have to really consider about this case at this point in time, is looking at all different perspectives of this and then trying again to answer that question, how is it impacting our society today? If we don't acknowledge the fact that Topeka was a Jim Crow town and how it impacted its residents, how can we ever move forward in the discussion of equity and inclusion?
Yeah, that's a really good point. As someone said in the chat, what do we lose is a question that still, echoes and will continue to echo. So let me ask you this. What happened to these women after the case, the trial? Were they scorned? Were they heralded as heroes? And how were they, how come we're just hearing all their names for the first time in this segment?
I'm going to blame it on community memory and biases. So, it's almost a whole lecture on how history operates and works in the world. But we tend to elevate, at this point in time, and it's just changing, that men are elevated, that their contributions are elevated. The way the case is written, and some is part of it. So as we were doing our research, you could see and notice the women's voices slowly fading away, meaning in the beginning, right as the case, you would at least get some, someone might ask them for an interview or someone might ask one for a question. But as time went on, I found it very interesting and disheartening. By the time I got to a newspaper in the 1990s, I think it was, it listed all the women. I was like, oh, great, someone picked them up. But there were so many times it's like, no information known, no information known. And I think part of that is because they're women, they got remarried, some of them moved away, some of them died, but they did not get that continual acknowledgement because their name was not the lead name. Community memory, you honor and uplift the one you want to remember. The joy is part of it. So again, they were not necessarily falling in with the tide of the community. So I think their voices might have been put to the side a little bit. Not a little bit, they were.
Yeah. And so we have another question from the chat. Did these women work outside the home? Because like one of the assumptions might be, that they were picked because they were homemakers and that their livelihood wouldn't be affected if there was backlash, in the town. What did you find out about that?
From our research, we determined that the majority of them did work outside of the home, and at different times during the case, they were working outside of the home. So they were actually contributing to the economic stability of their households, during this time period. Topeka, during this time period, African American families were actually starting to move into the middle class, and part of the reason that is because there were two income earner households. So yeah, they were working outside of the home.
Do you remember any of the jobs that they held?
Well, teacher. One of them, no, I think that was the husband that worked at Vinegar's. Oh, goodness gracious. I didn't prefer that question.
Yeah, I put you on the spot there. I'm sorry.
You did. Yeah, no, but I can get that to you.
Yeah.
Oh, see, there we go. Marguerite. Well,
Marguerite Emerson
we need to follow up with her because she knows.
worked at the state capitol in janitorial services, and I know somebody else worked as a cook in at the VA.
Oh yeah, at the hospital there was a couple of hospital people. I love one of them was her entrepreneur. She had her own hair salon. It'll start coming back to me slowly.
Yeah. So another question from the chat, and keep them coming because these are awesome. Who was the most vocal of this group of women?
During the time period, my girl, Lucinda, I believe Lucinda Todd was the most vocal. After that, Zelma Henderson was probably the one we see on record the most. But a person who's actually not directly involved in that case, but really wanted to change history is Bernadine Scott. She was the wife of one of the Scott lawyers. She was very vocal about the case before she passed. I believe it was in the 90s. But Lucinda Todd is the one who would get out and do the public speeches. She was the one helping raise money. She was the one at the strategy sessions. She was probably the most knowledgeable. She was also, from what we can tell, the most educated one as well, and the oldest one. So Lucinda Todd grew up in Southeast Kansas, in Girard, Kansas, and had been coming back and forth to Topeka since her early 20s before she finally settled and married her husband, Alvin Todd.
And another question from the chat. What are your thoughts about how well the et al. Are represented at the Brown v. Board Historic Park? Ideas about what could increase representation there? Any thoughts?
I would like to go back to the park with a much more critical eye. From my memory, they are not represented in the site itself. But I think that can be easily be changed. Part of the reason why we do research projects like this is so the information can become available. So at the end of this project, when we finish up all our research, this information will go on repository. And it'll be available for people to either continue researching, because the research project is never done. I love those rabbit holes, but yeah, hopefully they will be able to incorporate the women a little bit more fully in the site.
And where did you find out all of this information?
Oh, about the women?
Yeah.
I have wonderful researchers such as you. And that's the funny thing. It's not like they were lost per se. It's just somebody needed to read the newspaper again and write it and document them. So we started out with something very simple, just trying to find their obituaries. And when we couldn't find their obituaries, then we went to census data. We went to the Topeka Shawnee County Public Library and looked in the vertical files. We have been to KU Spencer Research Library. I contacted, what was it, Yale? I contacted Yale Library and got a recording from there. So I feel like even though I haven't had the opportunity to leave Topeka, I've been all over trying to hunt down these women's stories.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the amazing thing about this project is because, it's history and what is saved and preserved is so focused on males, right? The men were the lawyers, the court cases, the judges were the lawyers, and those are the things that are preserved. So being able to kind of like really dig out this information to construct these individual lives as well as community, I think is some of the most valuable things about this project.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. Women's history and history of people of color are very same. A lot. They're pretty much the same in that you have to have different research strategies. We are not just going to go to a book and open it up and then their biographies fall out for us. We have to learn how to dig in a different way to get these stories documented. And that's why it's really important for us to make sure we leave this someplace that'll be accessible to other people as well.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about that because this information is going into a traveling exhibit, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, you want to say a little bit about that?
Yes. So as part of the way that we can share this information, I mean, articles are wonderful, but I think people like to see things. They're very visually oriented, and sometimes you can learn a story that way. So Humanities Kansas gave us funding to do what we're calling the Women of Brown. And so this exhibit will introduce you to the women, much more detailed case studies, summaries of who they are. But we also want to talk about the fact that anyone can start a movement. So one of the centerpieces of this exhibit is a big map of Topeka, and the women will be all color coded, and we will be able to see the different places in Topeka that they made those connections. I keep talking about those quiet connections, how we have social networks that we need to tap into. Well, the power of us being able to tap into our social networks means that we can change things. And I think that is the secondary goal of this exhibit, is that we as a community, we can change things. I mean, these 12 women from Topeka, Kansas literally changed the world. And hopefully by seeing the exhibit, you will know that you'll know who they are, you'll know how they did it, and will hopefully give you some next steps on how you too can be aware and understand of what's going on around you.
Yeah. And do you want to plug your Facebook page? And if people want to book the exhibit, would that be the place to go?
Well, sure. We're not quite that far, but yes, if you, for the moment, you can look me up on Facebook and we will be announcing, we will have a separate Facebook page just for the exhibit and being able to book it. But it'll be pretty simple. It'll be free. It's a pop-up exhibit, so there will be 4 or 5 panels that an individual person will be able to put up by themselves. And the cool thing is with the 70th anniversary coming on, if you're going to have different events or activities that, well, it doesn't even have to be related to the anniversary. You just want to learn something, and you want whoever is in your community who might ever come into that space to learn something too. Feel free to reserve this exhibit. Again, it'll be free. So, and those of you outside of Topeka, we're thinking about how to get that done.
Yeah. And there's a Women of Brown Facebook page, correct?
There is. It is not up yet. It's not published yet.
All right. So look for that soon. One last question before I turn it back to Julie. History is often considered old news. How can we continue to educate in ways that excite our young people?
Tell them the story. I mean, some of this, you have to literally just keep telling the story in ways that are accessible, I guess maybe is the better way. I find history, and this could be me and my biases, trust me. But I find history fascinating. Most of this stuff you just literally cannot make up. And the fact that when I learn something new about a woman or some historical event, I get excited and I want to know how it has impacted my life and what could happen next because of it or because of this knowledge. So yeah, I'm not sure that answered your question, but I don't know.
Well, thank you so much. This has been so interesting, and we are thrilled that you and your team have uncovered this important story. Everybody be on the lookout for the exhibit around Topeka, and I'm going to turn it back over to Julie.
Thank
you, Valerie.
Thank you, Valerie and Donna Rae. This was just so great. I just could have listened for longer, and the questions coming in through the chat have just been phenomenal as well. And I just want to echo this idea of tell those stories and also ask about those stories. I think that one of the things that really separates historians from the rest of us is your curiosity, right? You're always asking why this, why that? And I'm just so grateful that you didn't become a lawyer, Donna Rae, and that you are a historian and that you're able to do this work. And same for you, Valerie, as well. So thanks to all of you as well who are watching and listening and engaging. We're just so glad that you were able to join us today. Not only is there going to be a traveling exhibition about the women of Brown, but Donna Rae Pearson is also in a special speakers bureau that Humanities Kansas has put together for the 70th anniversary. So if you would like to bring Donna Rae to your community, your organization to talk about the women of Brown, please be sure to go to humanitieskansas.org and search for our speakers bureau, and you can find out how you can book her to come to your community. So I know Donna Rae has limited time, so she probably can't go everywhere in Kansas, but secretly in my head, I'm just like, let's get Donna Rae all across the state next year. So anyway, just keep that in mind. Take a look if you're interested in bringing her to your community as well. And be sure and reach out if you have questions as to how to do that. We're happy to help you out. But you'll want to save the date for our next big idea, which is Friday, March 15th at noon. We're going to turn the tables, and our host, Dr. Valerie Mendoza, moves from the interviewer seat to the interviewee seat. And we'll be talking with Valerie about her presentation called Beyond Brown, which is really looking at the impact of the case and other things on Latino school kids in Kansas. So how did Brown affect the greater population as well, specifically the Latino population here in the Midwest and in Kansas? And I know you won't want to miss that as well. And with that, I will say thanks from everyone who had the opportunity to be here today. We're just so grateful for your work and your research. And I hope everyone has a terrific weekend.
Thank you.